as he brings your word to us, Lord, and that your spirit would move here today.
Journey Kids and Chaos students, you guys are dismissed. That's 6th grade and under. One other announcement that wasn't on the list for Betsy. The Super Bowl is coming, and I know that for some of you, the Super Bowl is, like, who could care less? And so we're going to call it the Big Game Night, and we're going to set up some tables and chairs, and we're going to invite you to come, bring your friends, bring your games, and we're going to sit and play games for the first half of the big game that we will put up on the screen in this room. And so the sound will be up, and it will be the Super Bowl for those who care about the Super Bowl, and for those who don't, they'll be able to sit and just play and enjoy games. I believe Sherry and I's quick discussion is that there will probably be some chili and maybe some hot dogs that we will provide, and so there's sort of a base of a meal, and then we're just going to invite everybody to bring something game foodish, finger foodish to come and share, and it will just be a night to come and enjoy. And as you want to come and drop in, if you need to leave to take your kids home, we'll probably wrap up at halftime, just because the game can kind of linger long into the night. But we'll give you more details in the coming weeks. That will be February 4th. It's a Sunday, and that will be here in the evening. The ladies' Bible study was already going to be taking that week off, and we're going to just kind of turn it into a community event. Well, if you have been here last week, you know that we started our new series called Drawing Near, and we are looking at some people whose names that most of us, if we've been around church and read the Bible, whose names we know. If that's not you, if you're someone who hasn't been around the church and you're not familiar with the Bible, we're going to introduce you to some of these, sort of great historic guys and ladies occasionally, names you will learn. And this morning we're going to be looking at a guy whose name is Job, and we preached the book of Job here in the last little bit, not that long ago, and so we're going to be kind of covering the whole book. For those who know me best know that when I tell stories, I like to give lots of context. I always feel like that gives you sort of why are people doing these things, and why is that as funny as I think that it might be, because I like to tell funny stories that are never nearly as funny to anybody else as they are to me, mostly because I think you don't know the context. So when I'm preaching some of these people, what I want to give you is the context. Why is this event, this thing that's happening, so significant? And so last week, when we were looking at Jacob, right, and his encounter as he wrestled with what we believe ultimately was God himself, we didn't just go, here's what happened when Jacob wrestled. We went, here is the hundreds of years of history that got us to this place. This is why this is significant. And we really started all the way in Genesis 12 and got, 30 chapters into the book before we would have gotten to our story. And that's what we're going to kind of do this morning as we think about Job. Because we're going to sort of preach through the text this morning is at the end of the book. It's Job chapter 42. And it's the encounter that God and Job have at the end of a sort of a long story. And so I want to tell you that story. I want to give you that context. But before we kind of dive into the details of it, let me say this. Job is often presented, sometimes when people are going through suffering or it looks like suffering, sometimes we're told, well, Job's the book for suffering. And that's, I believe, true, and we're going to talk about why that is this morning. But one of the things that is difficult is that Job is not for simple suffering. Job is like graduate level course. And so if we come with an elementary understanding of who God is and how he works, and we bring sort of ourself in there with it, and we don't let it tell us what it wants to tell us, Job can be a pretty frustrating book. Because we're going to want, as we read the story and as we hear about the encounter, we're going to want the book of Job to give us something. And it's the thing that we long for when we are suffering. We want answers. We want explanations. We want to know the conclusion. We want to know this is all going to work out in the end. And here's how. And here's why this happened to us. That's not what the book of Job gives us. And I think we're going to talk about why that is and why it's still God's method and instruction for how do we suffer and how does suffering help us to draw near to Him. But so often as we go, I want to meet God. I want to draw near to Him. And maybe, right, we're still at the beginning of the year. It's still January, so we can still say that, right? We're at the spot, and maybe that was part of somebody's resolution, or that was just sort of the desire of their heart. This year, I'm gonna draw close to God. I want to know Him better. I want to see Him better. I want to know God. And maybe you made some commitments. Maybe your plan is to read the Bible or pray more, or maybe that's the reason you're here in the room. You're going to come to a worship service more often, and that's all good. Those are not bad things. But so often drawing near to God looks very different than what we expect. Many of you know I was a youth pastor for a better part of a decade, and I planned intentional opportunities for students to meet and encounter God. So we would do cool stuff, right? I mean, I had mission trips and retreats and camps, and I grew up going to youth group, and so like you would go to a week of camp, right? And there was always that Friday night, and you'd sit around the big bonfire, and students would stand up and they'd tell you, I met the Lord this week, and here's what He taught me, and here's what He showed me, and often they'd throw their stick on the fire, and it's this great sign of commitment. I took a retreat one time with a bunch of students, and we went to a place in Tennessee called Buck Bald Mountain. I always want to say Buck Naked Mountain, and that always the one that always will get me into trouble. But no, it was Buck Bald Mountain because it was a mountain. You wound up all these switchbacks through the woods, and you get to the top, and it was like someone had, it was like a bald-headed guy. So there was sort of this ring of trees, but the very top of the mountain was this wide open. You could see for just miles and miles. And we went up there, and the kids, and profound devotions, and the opportunity to share. Like, that's what I did. I tried to create these opportunities for the kids, and these students, and these adults, and myself, and how do we meet God, and how do we draw near to Him? And I'm not saying those things are bad things, but those are not usually the way that God draws near. Those are the things we can produce. Those are sort of the events that we can fashion. And like this morning, right? We're here and Kendall's playing, and I hope that when you're here and we're singing and praying, and even while I'm preaching, I hope that you're encountering God, you're meeting Him. But what we're going to see, I think, in the life of Job, we certainly saw it last week in Jacob, and we will see it again next week when we talk about Joshua, is that God does not tend to meet us sort of in the planned environments. He doesn't get scheduled. He doesn't like daytimers where you go, I've got time for God, like at 9:46 on Tuesday, but God, if you don't get in the window, then, I'm going to be on to my next appointment. That's not God. God shows up. God rolls in His time, in His way, and often we're going to see, almost always, there's an element of suffering that's involved. In fact, but I think it's helpful to know, I believe that God's present, when we encounter Him, when we see Him, certainly I think we have a biblical pattern to say this. It often is so contrary to what we expect, it's not even usually pleasant. It's not like, boy, I got to sit with my good friend with a comfortable fire, and we discussed the latest happenings of the day, and when I went home, I felt so enriched. That's not an encounter with God very often. Now Job, let's tell his story. Job was an upright guy. That's what we get presented. Job was a good man. He did good stuff. He was honest, and he was a guy of integrity, and he loved his wife, and he loved his kids, and he took good care of his servants, and people liked him. He had a great reputation with the neighbors, and he was wealthy. Right? He had what we think like the American dream. He had it all. He had a great reputation. He was a guy who was somehow able to have this great reputation while doing all of the right stuff and get all of the things that people would think that they would want. one of the reasons this book is so difficult is that we're not going to know what to do with what's about to happen. When we start to hear the story, there's some questions that get asked and some things, and we want more details about it. Right? For those of you that know what's coming, Satan is about to walk into the throne room of God and ask for the opportunity to test Job. Is that what always happens? I don't know. Does Satan have free access to walk into God's throne anytime that he wants to and pick individual people out and go, I'm going to bring trouble into their life? I don't know. Does God always give him permission? Or does he always go, you can do this and not that, which is what we're about to see that he does with Job? I don't know. Does Satan always get to walk in a second time and go, well, the first time didn't really work. It didn't accomplish the thing that I thought. I want to do it again. And God go, you can do this, but you can't do that. I don't know. There's a lot of questions in the book that we don't get answered. And sometimes, always, quite bluntly, that feels like God's not giving me the answers that I want. I think he didn't give Job the answers that he wanted either. Because that's what happens in the story, right? The enemy walks in and he looks at God and he goes, listen, I see Job. I see your servant. And God going, did you notice? Did you see how good he is? Did you see how upright he is? Did you see how honest he is? Did you see all of these things? Have you noticed him? And the enemy's going, I have noticed him, but I think the only reason that he's behaving that way is because you've given him all this good stuff. And if you take the good stuff away, you'd figure out that he just really wanted you for the stuff. He didn't really want you, God. And so God says, all right, you're allowed to test. You're allowed to bring trouble and suffering into his life. You can go sort of this far, but no further. And so the consequence of that, the story tells us, is that for 4 different times, right, we've got Job, and he's sort of, the picture I have of him is Job standing on his porch. Now, this maybe is my own picture, but right, I mean, he's holding a nice cup of coffee. His wife is sitting somewhere close. They're gazing out over the land and the property and the stuff and they're just life is good. It's the idyllic, like Wyoming picture. That's just what I've got in my brain. Ride along with me. And while he's standing here, coming up the lane comes one of his servants. And the servant looks harried and terrified and overwhelmed and crushed. And Job is starting to get that look on his face, right? Something's going on. And the servant comes and says, Job, I was one of the servants out with all of your cattle. All of your, and this was a significant amount because Job was a wealthy guy. And he said, listen, we were out there and the other servants, and we were watching and we were taking good care and we were herding these. And the marauders came over the hill. And they killed all of the other servants, and I barely escaped. I had to crawl through the weeds to get here just to tell you what happened. And they've captured all of your cattle. And in that moment, boom, right? I mean, all of a sudden, Job's, a significant portion of his wealth has just been taken away. And while he's standing there, while the guy's still standing on his porch, another servant comes crawling out of the weeds, up the lane, looking the same way. And he goes, Job, tragedy. I'm one of the shepherds. We were out. We had all your flocks, and lightning struck, and all of the sheep are dead. And all of the other shepherds are dead. And I barely, do you see the singe, my coat's down so a little, there's some smoke still coming out. I barely escaped. And I'm here to tell you, and in that second moment, and the rest of Job's wealth is gone. And both, as that guy's finishing, as the sentence is coming out of his mouth, a third servant is coming up and saying the same thing about his camels. And that guy no sooner gets done than a fourth servant comes walking up the lane, crushed, teared. And he says, listen, Job, do you know your kids? Your 7 sons and your 3 daughters, you know the great relationship that they have. You know how, once a week they gather at somebody's house and they sit around and they feast and they enjoy one another because you've done such a great job of parenting them and life is so great. Your kids actually like each other and want to spend time. A wind blew. And it knocked that house down. And your children, all 10 of them, and all of the servants that were there attending to them and caring for them and providing their food, do you see my busted ankle? Because caught me too, and I just barely got out. And I'm here to tell you that all of your kids are dead. We sometimes, for some of us, we've heard this story. We've heard it so many times that the impact of that, the weight of that, the reality of that. Just let that sort of sit on you for a second and imagine that that's what has taken place in your life. Your worldly wealth, your children, your reputation, right? Because there's a part we're going to figure out here pretty quickly that the part of what people thought was God really liked Job. And all of a sudden, right, all of that, the sort of his reputation and his family and his wealth, all gone. But Job, after this first wave of the enemy moving in and bringing trouble into his life that has come through the hand of God, right? God gave permission. And this has come and this is washed over Job. And here he is. And Job's response, right? He shaves his head, he rips his clothes, he falls to the ground, it says to us, and then he starts to speak. And he says, listen, I was naked when I came into the earth. I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And if the book stopped right there, that would make a great sermon. That's good theology. That's the sort of thing that I would say to you. I hear that. That's true. There are no U-Hauls ever being pulled behind hearses. People don't take anything with them. What you have, you come in naked, you leave naked, it's all God's. That's good theology. Job's in a good spot. He has responded well to this first wave of stuff. Not as helpful as I think what's we're about to hear. I think there's more. I think it's deeper. But it's still good. There's a good lesson there. But catch the second wave. Satan walks in a second time, the throne room of God. He says, yeah, but you didn't, you withheld some stuff, God. You didn't let me get all the places that I want. You didn't really let me reveal who he is. And so God again says, okay, you can do that, but you can't, there's still some parts, there's still restraint. God still holds back some of the things that the enemy wants to bring. And he attacks Job's health. And it says to us that Job has running open wounds and sores. That they are pus-filled to the spot where he is, at this stage now, sitting on broken pottery and ashes, scraping his body with broken pieces of pottery to try and sort of itch and scratch and clean himself. He's crushed, the physical oppression that's taking place in his life. That's the first thing that the Lord allows into his life in this second wave. The second thing that God allows into Job's life is 4 counselors. 3 friends and a wife. And they're going to give bad advice, all 4 of them. They're going to say wrong stuff to him, all 4 of them, but in sort of 2 very different directions. First of all, he has a wife, and the wife says, in chapter 2, verse 9, if you want to read it, you should curse God, Job, and die. It's interesting, and we don't have time to sort of unpack all of this, but the wife, all of these things that have happened to Job have also happened to the wife. She's sort of caught up in the drama, right? She doesn't get sort of mentioned outside until all of this moment she shows up. But these are her kids and sort of her wealth and her comfort and her, right? All of that stuff. She's in the same place. And this shaking out, this character creation that's taking place in Job's life is also taking place in hers. But she shows up and looks at her husband and goes, God hates you. God is crushing us. Will you please just curse him and die? Now Job, I think very cautiously, looks at her and says, "You are talking like a foolish woman." He doesn't call her a foolish woman. I think there's some value in that. He says, "You're sounding like the foolish women I've heard speak before." Job tries. But the wife, the counsel, right? I mean, this is his wife. He doesn't leave her. He doesn't divorce her. She's around. She's going to continue down this line. Will you please just blame God? This is his fault. He has done this to us. He's a bad God. He's harming us. This is his fault. Please hate him with me. He also gets some friends who show up. Guys with weird names that are hard to pronounce. And these guys, over the next 30 plus chapters of the book of Job, are going to say one sort of recurring theme to him. What have you done wrong, Job, that God would do this to you? See, his wife says, this is God's fault, blame God and die. And his friends show up and say, this is your fault, Job. You're not innocent. You've done something. God is judging. If you will just repent. And Job just sort of keeps recounting, I'm not that guy. Here's all of the things that I've done. I'm not perfect, but I'm innocent. There's no grand sin here. They give different advice, bad advice. One says blame God himself. The other one says blame yourself. And Job, right, I mean, under the weight of this, he sort of made it safely through the first wave, but the second wave of his own open wounds and the brokenness of his physical body, and the fact that those that are sent to him to give him counsel and encouragement really mostly just either blame God or blame Job. Job withers under that. And Job comes to the spot where he essentially starts to say these things like, I just wish I was never born. I wish my mom had never spread her knees. I wish my mom hadn't even fed me after I was born. I just wish I was dead. And Job begins to argue, right? He's got these two things going on. You're either guilty, blame yourself, or God's bad, blame him. And Job's response is to argue that he's innocent. And we see that. And you get to chapters 29 and 30 and 31, and Job starts recounting. He sort of starts laying out his own resume, and Job is a good guy. I mean, we see it, whether it's socially or sexually or relationally. Job was an upright guy. He did the noble, honest, ethical things. And he's standing here going, why me? God, why would you let this stuff happen to me? I did it all the right way. I signed all the right documents. I went all the right places. I treated people well. I was a good dad. Why is this happening to me? He suffers with this sort of innocent, like, why are you doing this to me, God? And the second thing that he does is he starts to go, God, where are you? And he says things like, if I could find him, if I knew what door to knock on, if I knew if I could go and walk in the room and sit down and like I could argue my way with God, I would explain to him why I don't deserve all of this stuff that he's allowed happen in my life. But he won't talk to me. You look in chapter 23, right? He says, if I knew the door, I'd state my case and I'd argue my innocence. And then, right, after all of this is chapters and chapters of stories and counsel and all this stuff that's going on. You come to chapter 38 and God shows up into the story. And he shows up in a whirlwind, in a storm. And again, this is why, this is adult stuff. This is like mature. You need to understand. You need to have ears that recognize truth from error. Because this is not simple, what we're about to hear. God does not give Job what he expects. He doesn't give Job what we expect. He doesn't give him what he wants. He certainly doesn't give him what we want. He doesn't give him what Job thinks he deserves, and he certainly doesn't give him what we think Job deserves. Here's what God doesn't do. Here's why I think this is really hard for us. God doesn't explain. God doesn't get to know about the heaven conversation. Job doesn't get the enemy walked in and looked at your life and asked to sift you out, and I gave him permission, but I withheld this stuff from him so that he couldn't do this. I only let this much through, Job. He doesn't get that. Job doesn't get it's all going to turn out okay in the end. Don't you worry, I'm going to restore all of these things to you. He doesn't get, Job, here's the ways that I'm trying to work and shape, and here I see this in your character, Job, and I'm trying to sort of sift through this stuff, and I want to help you, and he doesn't get any of that explanation. Job doesn't get told. And that's what Job's been asking for. Job's been begging and pleading and sort of shouting and arguing and declaring, God, I just want you to explain it. Just tell me why. And when God shows up, that's not at all what he gets. And worse, when you read that, and I remember that, like the first time I read Job with a level of understanding as an adult, not as a teenager who thought that, like the girl who broke up with me and didn't think I was very nice anymore, that was like the edge of my suffering. As an adult, when sort of real life shows up and then you all of a sudden start to read it and you figure out what Job is sort of really talking about, and then you read God's response, and not only does he not explain, but it's almost like he's mean. It's almost harsh. It certainly isn't comforting. It sounds like, right? I mean, God almost goes on an offensive. Because God starts to say stuff that essentially boiled down to is, who are you? Job, who are you to question me? I made the stars. I hung the sun. I'm the one who every day makes sure that it rises and sets in a set pattern so that you all can count on it. I'm the one who keeps the sea restrained in the sea and the land in the land, and I'm the one who spoke and those things took place. And when I created, God says to him, where were you? Who are you? I rose the sun. Who are you? I restrained the ocean. I'm old. I've been eternal. I've been forever and will be forever. Who do you think you are? And I mean, just if you read those sections of Scripture, like it's this like tidal wave of Job, I'm God. I'm the God of the universe. I am holy and just and righteous. Who are you to stand here and argue and question me? Do the lightning bolts answer to you? God says to him. Did you put the ocean monsters that swim in the dark places that mankind has never, I believe, even to this day, seen? Who are you? And Job's first response, right? So God shows up in the storm, in the whirlwind, and just starts sort of just rolling over him with this, who are you? And Job, the first words we hear from Job, essentially what he says is, I've got my hand over my mouth. I've got nothing to say. I don't even know how to respond to you. And you think, oh, okay, well now God's going to go, all right, Job, now that we've sort of set up, here's who I am and here's who you are, here I'm going to lay it out for you. No, God goes, oh yeah? You got nothing to say now? Well, catch this. I've got more to say. Are you capable of judging righteousness and unrighteousness? Are you the one who's going to divide truth and error? Are you the one who's going to crush the wicked and grind them to dust? Are you the one who decides who lives and dies? The astounding thing to me is that this, Job not getting in any way what we thought he deserved, what he thought he sort of had earned and should have gotten, is transformative in his life. He doesn't get it all what he thinks he wants or deserves. And God uses it to transform him. He gets no explanation, no comfort, and yet the next time we see Job speak, he goes, "You're right. You're right. I'm speaking about stuff I don't understand. Things too wonderful for me. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes see you." Let's read that in Job chapter 42. Job answers the Lord, and he says, chapter 42, verse 2, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Job goes, I'd heard some stuff about you, God. I knew some stuff. I'd heard some lessons. I'd heard some of the stories, and I thought I knew who you were, but now I've seen you. I've experienced you. I've met you. Job's turbulence, turmoil, the trouble, the pain that is translated into pride and anger and bitterness is put to rest. As God speaks, as he sort of shouts out of the thunder, out of the lightning, out of the storm, Job is humbled and transformed. Now it seems like God shows up, does all the wrong stuff, and Job gets transformed. He looks at Job. If you keep reading, verse number 7 of chapter 42. "And after the Lord had spoken these words to Job," right? So Job and God have had this huge conversation. After that's taken place, the Lord shows up to Eliphaz, the Temanite. That's one of the counselors who was a bad counselor. And he says, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right. You were giving him bad advice and bad counsel." "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore," he says, "listen, you've done this wrong. Job has been doing it right. So take these bulls, 7 bulls, 7 rams, go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering. Go and worship with Job. Go and sit and listen to Job talk about the things he's heard from me. Go worship. And my servant Job shall pray for you, and I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly." I'm going to give you the Jerry translation of what God just said. You're an idiot. Go figure it out with Job. Now, that's not there in the Hebrew, but you're stupid, and you've screwed it up, and you've misrepresented me for pages and pages and pages and bad counsel. Go listen to Job. Go learn from Job. Now, that long story, and there's some lessons in here I want us to kind of glean from as our time comes kind of in for a landing. We're going to start with a philosophical question, and then we're going to do some what I'd call foundational ones. We'll end with kind of a practical lesson. First, the philosophical lesson. Much of philosophy, as it intersects with theology, as people try to sort of debate and wrestle out, is there a God, and can he be real, and is he the one that looks like this in the Bible, comes down to sort of 2 essential things. It's about the goodness of God and the power of God. And the essential argument kind of comes down that there's evil in the world, bad things are happening. Tragic things happen. Babies die, and there's disease, and storms blow in, and sort of the stuff that took place in Job's life. That stuff happens. So either we don't have a God who can stop it. So he lacks the power. He's not sort of an all-powerful, omniscient God who can see stuff coming, or he would stop it. So he lacks some power over here, or he's not really good. He doesn't want to stop it. So if you have a God who is capable of stopping it and he isn't, right, then he must not be good. And I think what the story shows to us is that we have that kind of a God who is powerful enough, right? He restrains. He's the one who determines this much gets through, this much doesn't. The things that get to Job, and consequently I think we can extrapolate out, the things that get to us, the things that get to the rest of mankind, have come through the hand of God. It's not quite so sort of binary and simplistic as folks want to try and make it. Part of the problem is, like Job, like you and I, God's not in the business of just answering our questions. He's not Siri, where we get to ask the question, and if we frame it in the right way, he's going to give us the thing that we're looking for. God isn't just there to answer our questions. He's not there to answer the philosophers. He is showing, I believe the book of Job shows to us, that he is both good and powerful. Nothing comes to Job that hasn't passed through his hand. Job controls Satan and restrains him in the spots where he wants to. But suffering and evil are not his plan. Like, that's not his original plan. God hates evil. He weeps with those who weep. He hates it, but he allows it for the purpose. The suffering is accomplishing something. So I think there's a sort of a philosophical, you want to sort of live out here. Some of you have those kinds of questions. I think that's part of the answer to it. Now let's think about some foundational lessons for us about suffering. Right? Some of us are in the midst of it. Some of us, it's around the corner and we haven't seen sort of what's on its way yet. And again, this is strong medicine. Right? This is hard to hear some of this. But I want you to hear it. Lesson number one is you ultimately have to trust God. You may want a more profound answer. You may want sort of a more loquacious and lots more words answer. But it's at its most fundamental, when we enter suffering and when it's rolling in our life, the spot we've landed has got to be, I trust God. I'm going to trust him. Because what we see here, I think, in this story is, what the lesson God teaches to Job is, you aren't competent to be my judge. Only one of us, like if God is literally standing here on the stage, only one of us is smarter than the other. Only one of us is more capable of giving the other the answers to why the things in the universe are taking place. And let me give you the answer to the quiz. It's not Jerry. God's more competent. He knows stuff we don't know. He sees stuff we don't see. He's accomplishing things we don't know about and can't imagine. He's giving us things. Things are passing through his hands and getting to us that we don't understand, because he's God. And part of the difficulty for Job and for us in the midst of suffering is we assume that we understand all of the things that are happening. We believe, right, that our finite sort of little-sized pea brains get all that is taking place. God goes, listen, lightning, snow, sunrises and sunsets, and right, and disease, like all this stuff, they're in my control. Who are you? And so often in the midst of suffering, we see Job miserable, and we ourselves end up in spots of misery because we're trying to take the responsibility to say, I understand all that is happening, and it should be happening differently than this. At a certain point, we either trust God and go, this is above my pay grade and I don't get it. Or we assume that we're smarter than God. Now, I'm going to go even one step further. Right? Because sometimes, right, people get here and they get to the spot of suffering and they go, I don't believe there is a God. If there isn't a God, why are you complaining? If there isn't a God, who are you shouting at? As difficult as it is to believe in God in the midst of suffering, I think it's even more difficult to not believe in God. C.S. Lewis was talking about suffering in a spot, and what he said was, long ago, the ancients, is how he described it. They, when you think about the way they, like in the Greeks and some of that kind of stuff, when they talked about gods, there was always that the gods were the judge and the people kind of had to come in to them and answer to them and account for their lives and all that kind of stuff. And Lewis said that the thing that's happened to us as moderns is we now sit in the judge's seat and we ask God to come in and explain himself to us. We now sit here going, I know the law, I know what's good and right, I know what love looks like, I know what righteousness looks like, and who are you, God? And we, as though we say, God, you've got to present your case. Show to us, demonstrate to us that your plan is better than ours. And what we're doing, right, we're elevating ourselves and saying, we get to sit in judgment of God. So either there is no God and we should stop complaining because nobody is listening to us, or there is a God and you aren't him. And you can't know what he knows and see what he sees. Second foundational lesson. Suffering is for the purpose of your transformation. Right? The answer to suffering starts at a spot that says we trust God, and then it transitions to a spot that says recognize that the suffering is for the purpose, the role of our transformation. When Satan and God walk, it's like Satan walks into the throne room and begins to have this conversation with God. What's taking place, you see God, when you read that story, God keeps talking about my servant Job, my servant Job, my servant Job. Have you seen him? Do you notice him? Have you seen who he is? Have you recognized his character? My servant Job. And the enemy, his basic argument is the only reason that you think of him as your servant is because the only reason he's showing up is because you, God, serve him. You're giving him all of this stuff. Satan asks in the midst of that this sort of haunting question, if you let it. I hope it haunts you a little bit. Okay? Ask yourself this question. Does he serve you for nothing? Does he serve you for nothing? In other words, does he simply serve you, God, because you're God? Or is he only serving you to get the things that you're going to give him? And then he goes on and says, listen, we're going to attack him. You're going to let me, God. I'm going to get to him. And you will see that the result of that is that he will curse you. When we start to see that suffering is for the purpose of our transformation, it's the means of revealing. Do we see God as our servant or us as his? Do we believe that we are the master, that we are the judge, and that God sits under and answers to us, or do we recognize that he is the God of the universe? That he knows and sees and understands and plans and intends stuff far beyond what we can sort of ask and imagine. And it isn't until the suffering comes that we realize that most of us, probably even all of us, got started down this sort of Jesus church faith thing because we wanted God to serve us. We show up because we come to the spot where we go, if I serve him, then he'll do this thing. He'll take care of my family. He'll help me to have a good job. He'll help he'll do the stuff. And so we enter into the relationship with us at the top going, now God's going to have to come underneath and be what I'm calling him to be. And suffering reverses that and allows us to see that we are not the king. We're not the one. He is the ruler and the reigner. He is the thrower of lightning and the rolling of the thunder and the setting of the sun. He sets and hangs the stars. He speaks and there is life and death. That is who God is, and we are not him. One last foundational lesson. As Job is talking, he keeps talking about that he's this sort of innocent sufferer, that he's never done anything wrong. And it's through Job's suffering, right, this encounter that he's having, that ultimately we see the enemy get defeated. Right? The enemy is wrong. God demonstrates as speaking out of the storm to Job. Job doesn't curse him ultimately, right? Job comes under, he's transformed, he's recognized that he is the servant and God is king, and the enemy in that sense has been defeated as a result of his suffering. And then he says, and now Job, right, you've done the stuff. Now your friends are going to come and they're going to, like, together you're going to worship and you're going to teach and they're going to learn from you. You're going to intercede on their behalf. You're going to pray for them. Job, who claimed to be the innocent sufferer, in the reality, right, Job wasn't perfect, but there is one who is perfect. Job points to us in this conversation about innocent suffering, that there is one who would come, who would in his perfection and sinlessness suffer on our behalf, who intercedes. Even now, we're told, he sits at the right hand of the Father, interceding, praying for us on our behalf. And that one, that Jesus, didn't deserve the consequences of his sin, right? Job, as a sinner, did deserve the consequences. He had violated the law of God. He deserved to be crushed and separated from the Father. But Jesus didn't. And the one, that Jesus, the innocent sufferer, in the moment on the cross when he asks, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? This, until we get to this spot where we see that he was crushed, because we're all not sinless, but he was. Where we see that he was bloodied on our behalf as the truly innocent one, that he makes a way for us in the midst of our suffering. Job points us to that one. One last lesson, and this is the practical one. At the very end of this story, God and Job are talking, and God says something really interesting. He says to Job, if you read it with me, in verse number 7, my anger burns against you and against your two friends, right? He's talking to the bad counselors. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Job has been doing some right stuff in the midst of his sort of foolishness, in the midst of his doubt, in the midst of his questioning, in the midst of that stuff. There were things that Job was saying and doing that were right. Now, he'd had bad days, right? Job was not innocent. Job was not perfect. He had cursed God and cursed his life and accused God and ranted and raved, right? The self-pity, all this stuff. He had done stuff that wasn't good. But in the midst of that, what he had never stopped doing was pursuing God himself. He never stopped going, can I find God? Because Job knew that the solution, the answer to his suffering was what? Wrapped up in God himself. His motives weren't always pure. And your and I's motives, quite bluntly, will not always be pure. But oh, that we might find him. Job wanted to find him so that he could give him a piece of his mind. We sometimes want to find God, right? We want to listen. We want to shout. We want to give him a piece of our mind. I certainly have had those days. But Job was pursuing God and ultimately finds the very meaning of his life because he kept pressing into God instead of running from him in the midst of his suffering. Friends, I know that for those of us who are actually in the middle of suffering, this is a hard thing to hear. Just so you know, if you call me into a hospital room where someone has gotten a bad diagnosis or someone is passing, I am probably not recounting this story of Job to you. That's not the kind of counsel that this is. But in the midst of your suffering, if that's where you're sitting this morning, hear this. Press into God. That's the thing that Job did right. He never stopped pursuing God. And recognize, I believe we know far more today reading this story than Job ever knew about the purposes of God, of the things that were taking place in his life. At the very least, right, we get to see Jesus. We get to see that there really was an innocent one who was going to come, who would die on our behalf, whose blood would be shed, who would go to the cross for us. Job didn't see that. We've got far greater information than Job possessed. And so in the midst of your suffering today, I encourage you, preach to yourself. This is why you get God. This is why He is the King and you are not. And in the midst of your suffering, get Him. Don't settle. Don't stop. Chase God Himself. Go deeper with Him. Don't settle for just hearing about Him. Don't let somebody else's story be sufficient, but press yourself into Him. See Him, rest in Him as your King, as the one. And then in the midst of our suffering, may we be more and more like that Jesus. May we in the moments that feel like we're being forsaken, as we cry those things out, may we see that He has met us exactly where we are, in the one who loves us that way. Let's pray this morning. Father, we come. And Father, I would ask in a special way for those of us who sit this morning with real suffering, whether that is a brokenness in relationship or a health concern and disease, whether that is mourning real and genuine loss. We've been attacked. The thing that we've been working so hard towards has been taken from us. Father, whatever that suffering looks like this morning, I would ask that you would meet those folks right now. And that, Father, they would not just hear of you, but that they might see you. That they would see that the King of the universe, high and holy, almighty God, rests on the throne and invites them in. And that because Jesus went to the cross on our behalf, that those of us who were sinners, those of us who were far from that kind of a God, have been brought near. That your word promises to us that if we will say, I need you, I long for you, I can't do this on my own, that in that moment of weakness you will embrace us, that you will call us your sons and daughters. That you will open for us the storehouse of heaven and bless us in ways and in times and that we cannot expect or imagine. And Father, for some of us that aren't in the midst of our lives, or at least seems like it's just kind of rolling along, may we be good counselors. May, as we encourage and encounter and engage with those who are experiencing real difficulty, may we speak your truth to them. May we offer and extend the promise that this kind of God is available and real and longs to be known. And Father, in a very special way, as we close our time, I just want to say to those who don't feel like God is their dad, that God is their king. This doesn't feel like the kind of God that they've heard about or that they could know. And Father, I pray right now in this moment that they would humble themselves, crawl into your lap, acknowledge their need, and declare you as their dad. We pray these things in the great name of Jesus. Amen. We now this morning have the opportunity to respond. You may be in a genuine spot of suffering. And what you need is just someone to cry with you and to pray with you and to love you and to sort of be God with skin on. I invite you that while we're taking communion, while we're singing You Come, we'll have guys standing up here on the two sides, and just say, you might not have the word, pray for me. And allow them to do that and be that with you and for you. For some of us, we need to stand and as we sing, we need to just go, I'm going to respond in a way that says, I can't do this, and I'm going to show that to myself, to my kids, to my spouse, to the people who are in the room with me, by walking this aisle, taking that bread and going, this was Jesus, who saw me when I couldn't do it on my own and did it for me. And we dip it in the juice or the wine and we go, this was his blood shed for me, because spilling my own would mean I was undone. And so he did it for me. And we take that and we eat. And as we consume that, we remind ourselves that we're not God, that he is, and that he loves us right where we are. Let's stand together and sing this morning.
find me in the river. Find me on my knees. Walked against the water. Now I'm waiting if you please. Long to see the roses. Never felt those. But ugly crowds never paid the price. Find me